Hello, this is Derek Hansen, and in this video I'm going to talk about resisted sprint training. It's probably one of the most common questions I get about doing sprint training. Can I do resisted sprint training? How much should I do? How heavy should I go with my resisted sprint training? So I'm going to try to address all of these questions in a brief video and just give you some insight into what I do. So if you're talking resisted sprint training, there's different things that you can do. One could be hill sprints. Another could be sled pulls. Some people will classify sled pushes, so I'll put that in and I'll discuss. And there are a few other things that people might try to roll into resisted sprint training, like you'll see parachutes, that's a common one. And sometimes I'll throw in here as well. So sometimes I'll throw in weighted vests for vertical resistance, but also you'll see that there's a lot of devices out there, machine devices with cable resistance. Some are more sophisticated than others, some are a lot more expensive as well. So we're going to go through all these different options here, but first it's probably easiest to start with hill sprints because you don't really need equipment. Obviously you need access to a hill. So we're going to talk a bit about hill sprints, then we can talk about sled pulls, sled pushes, which a lot of people like to do nowadays, parachutes and other kind of wind-related resistance devices, weighted vests, and cable resistance. So that's the list we're going to go through. So a good place to start is hill sprints because, like I said, no equipment required. You just need a relatively gradual grade. And when you're choosing a slope, I'll often say the slope that you want is something that's going to be steep enough to obviously create resistance, but also hold posture for acceleration. And I'm going to keep harping on this idea of establishing ideal posture for acceleration. And that's where a lot of this is going to help most, is in early and middle to late acceleration, so using resistance. So if you're sprinting up a hill, the ideal grade that I have found has been about 5 degrees or around 8 to 9%. Now that may not seem like a lot. A lot of people think, well, that's a really nice steep hill. That's going to provide a lot of resistance and make me faster. The idea here, again, is to load and add resistance. But the other idea is to not deviate too much from a normal flat sprint in terms of ground contact time and in terms of velocities reached. So we want some specificity there too. So having a 5 degree or 8 to 9% grade not only provides enough resistance to load the body, but also to allow you still to run fast. The other thing it provides is enough slope to hold an acceleration posture. And what we're trying to do here with a hill sprint is, say we're going 30 meters or 30 yards, about the same. That's initial acceleration. There's some late acceleration in there as well, but it is targeting acceleration. Once you get beyond 30 meters for most athletes, they will either increase incrementally a little bit, they'll get a little faster, or some athletes don't even accelerate to 30 meters. So this is kind of a good zone to work on posture. And all the hill does is it holds them in that acceleration posture longer. So what it does is it gives you more time to work on technique for acceleration, more exposure to foot contacts in this acceleration position. So that's what I'm looking for from a hill. Now, if you want to, you can make it a little longer, but then I would decrease the slope of the hill, right? It would be not quite as steep, right? Or if you want to go steeper, I'd probably work a shorter distance. The idea of going up longer and longer and longer up a steeper slope, it just will be long ground contact times. It'll slow you down, and I don't necessarily want that. So maybe if you're going 0 to 15 meters, you can use a steeper slope. That makes more sense in terms of strength, power, and overloading those areas. Now, if you want to go a little longer, maybe you're out 100 to 200 meters. Slightly less of a slope is going to work on some qualities to load in terms of having that slight incline. It's just a little more difficult. You're working on work capacity, you're working on strength, endurance, those qualities. That makes more sense. But if you're working pure acceleration, this 0 to 30 is pretty much all you need. And if you can find a nice steady slope, then it gets interesting. What's also interesting is you may find a hill And I've had some hills like this constructed for different teams where it's a little more steep at the beginning. So this is early acceleration. And then late acceleration, it starts to flatten out and allows you to pick up to higher speed. So most of the heavy resistance is in the early portion. The early acceleration start to maybe about 15 meters, and then it starts to settle out and flatten out so that you can hit higher velocities moving forward. So that gets a little more interesting. If you find a slope like that, or you can construct one, then we have a different method of loading the athlete. But it's still pretty interesting if you can get that. If you can get a linear slope and more of a parabolic slope, I think you've got all your bases covered. So that's pretty much where I start. Hill sprints, if you have that, great. Now let's talk about some other alternatives. All right, so we have a sled pull scenario. We have a weighted sled here. Some of the sleds will vary in terms of surface area, so you have to keep track of that because it could be a little harder to pull if there's more surface area on the track. Obviously, the surface makes a difference too, but you see we have a flat approach here. We're having the athlete work on acceleration posture. So the same rules apply. We want to work on a longer distance of acceleration to hold that posture. And if we can get them 30, maybe 40 yards, then it becomes interesting for that acceleration portion. Now, if you want to go heavier and increase the weight of the sled, I wouldn't necessarily try to run as far. Maybe you're cutting them off, like I said, on the hill, 15 to 20 yards, and we're working on a heavier sled pull. And then we start to unload as we go short to longer distance, and we want to have a lighter sled so we can hit slightly higher velocities down here. But I think you have to have a plan around this. You can't just say, hey, we're going to load them heavy and they're going to get faster. It doesn't really work that way. I do like loading around the waist as opposed to the upper body, which can cause people to tighten up in the upper body and hunch over a little bit more to gain an advantage. I'd rather have it close to the center of mass where the attachment point is. But certainly using this sled arrangement can simulate what happens on the hill. Now you just want to make sure it's a relatively smooth resistance with that sled. You want to make sure the lead between the sled, because some of these devices you'll buy them and they'll have a short lead, but it tends to pull, if you have a shorter lead, it tends to pull a little more vertically and the sled can bounce quite a bit. So you want a relatively long lead, maybe about, I would say 6 to 10 meters, something a little longer so that you can have a nice smoother pull for that sled. But other than that, if you can figure out what this weight is to hold them in position, but still maintain a relatively good velocity, I always like about a 10 to 15% decrement in their unloaded time. So if they run, say, 0 to 30 in, say, 3 seconds, then it's going to be about 3.3, 3.4 if they're pulling a sled. So you want it relatively close. You don't want it to be too far off. Ideally, if you're using the heavier sled, maybe that's going to be a little closer, maybe about a 20 to 30% decrement, but that's just early acceleration working on strength and power as we discussed with the hill. So make sure you're doing this right. So in this example, we have a sled push. Now, again, for maximum strength and just general power, it's probably not a bad idea for short distances. So I would say 0 to 10 yards if you're using it as a sprint modality. You're trying to get somebody to be powerful. Beyond that, it just becomes a strength endurance event. And the other thing I'm not quite high on about this is you're pushing with the arms and you're locked in. I don't necessarily like that. It tightens up the arms and the shoulders. It doesn't allow you to rotate. And having the arms free during a resisted sprint is a much better arrangement for me. I'm not saying don't do this, but just use it sparingly. Use it probably in very early acceleration. Start maybe 5 yards, maybe 10. Don't overload it too much. You want to make sure they can get some movement out of it. But other things that I would do is maybe go 0 to 5 yards, and then I'd have them run around the sled and just finish with a sprint. That can be a little more interesting and a little more applicable to most sports. But having them push it longer than that, I wouldn't do that unless you have a specific strength endurance goal, but it has nothing to do with sprinting. It's just a conditioning method. So in this case, parachutes, you saw this maybe 20 years ago, more common 20, 30 years ago. I think people have figured it out and found out this isn't necessarily a great way to resist an athlete. You probably only get higher resistance at higher speed, so you're upright running, but then it tends to pull you. It can pull you back, it can pull you to sideways if there's a crosswind. It's very hard to manage resistance because there's an environmental condition that you just can't control. So I've really tried to dissuade people from using this modality or this tool for sprinting. There's other ways you can do it better. If you have a slight hill, if you run into a wind, then you can get some resistance there because your body's upright. It's going to absorb more of the wind and slow you down. But attaching a parachute, I've just gotten away from that. Honestly, I've never even used it because it never made sense to me. But I would probably try to avoid this type of resistance. It's just not beneficial, very hard to monitor, and there could be some safety issues around it if you get a heavy wind and a crosswind. So I'd avoid it at all costs. So another way to load an athlete would be a weighted vest. I've tried to show a vest here. I'm not a great artist, but the idea is to provide vertical loading. And again, this is probably going to make more sense for longer sprints. So maximum velocity, flying sprints, where you can work on controlling ground contact stiffness. And the weighted vest probably, honestly, shouldn't be more than about 10 pounds, because even adding 10 pounds to an athlete, there's a significant difference when you get up to speed. You can feel how it affects your ground contact. But I do like the idea of using weighted vests for certain drills to focus on that stiffness and strength and power on ground contact. Doesn't have to be too heavy, and the idea is to work on vertical force application. You don't want to be working on acceleration with a weighted vest. Doesn't make as much sense as a sled, but certainly for upright sprinting, for certain distances, not too long. You don't want to get too much fatigue in there, but maybe for a flying 20 or 30 and you're just working on vertical force application and stiffness. And so the last type of resistance device that you'll see out there, and I call it cable technology, and the idea is that you have some sort of device, a freewheel or something, that allows you to control the resistance via a cable. It could be a pretty long cable. It could be about 40 yards, 50 yards, 50 meters. But the other thing that happens here is that using this technology, you can control the amount of resistance, but also you can record velocities and collect other data related to the run. So it gets very interesting there. They are quite a bit more expensive. If you have like a 1080 Sprint or a Dynaspeed, it can get up to about $20,000. So it is cost prohibitive. There are some more affordable means of doing this. There's a run rocket that a lot of people use, and some of the newer versions can record velocity. So, there are different price points that you can dial into and use it. Obviously, you have to physically bring it to the training site. Not as easy as maybe a sled or finding a hill, but if you have a facility and you're using it indoors, what I like about some of these devices is you don't have to have as much deceleration room because the device will slow you down when you decide to stop. So it's not bad if you have a limited facility with maybe about 20 yards to sprint and then you have to stop pretty quickly. Then it gets interesting and you can have a workflow with different athletes where they come back and they just do their sprints. So I think it's not a bad option. A little more money, probably a little bit more of learning around how to use it properly and how to collect the data, but something to look into. And that's something that's growing. That's an area that's growing, and maybe it'll become more affordable as we move forward. Probably one of the most important areas to cover is planning. How do you use resistance to your advantage? And I'll try to be brief with this. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but certainly you typically want to start using the resistance and you always want to finish unresisted so the athlete understands, okay, this is how normal sprinting should feel. So you might do a grouping of resisted work, and that could be over 10 meters, 20 meters, and then 30 meters. So maybe you do all your resisted work first, and then you do unresisted. So you get the idea of working on resistance, loading a bit more, working on posture, and then you try it later in the workout with unresisted and see if they can start to integrate that technique. Okay, the other way. Another way would be to do an alternating method. So you go with a resisted series of sets, and then you go to unresisted over the same distance, and then you go resisted as you go a little longer, unresisted, and then unresisted. And the idea is, again, to get some resistance in, to work on posture and technique. Then let's see if you can hold that posture without. And then we move out a little farther and a little farther to see if we can keep that acceleration position once we take the resistance away. I like this method better. I like going back and forth because it gives an athlete a feel of where they should be and how to accommodate the resistance and then try it without the resistance. So I think from a planning point of view, if you can have a plan around moving and alternating through and giving that feel to the athlete of where they should position their head, where they should position their arms, I think it transfers a lot better. So hopefully this gives you some ideas about different types of resistance out there for sprinting, but also how to plan and program. If you have a large group and you have a hill, it's a little easier. If you have sleds or other resistance devices you have to work in, it gets a little more tough from a logistics point of view, but it is manageable. But certainly you don't want to let the resistance take over your sprint program. You want to use it as a tool and do the best you can and ultimately get people sprinting without resistance and running faster. So hopefully this helps. Thank you very much. And I'll try to do some more follow-ups and get into some deeper dives around the planning piece.